Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you and our good friends from C-SPAN to the McGowan Theater, located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager and producer of the Noontime Lecture Series. Before we begin today's program, I'd just like to remind you of some other programs that'll be taking place at this location in the near future. Tomorrow evening on Thursday, March 30th at 7:30 p.m., the state of Alaska is sponsoring a performance of the Alaska Chamber Group Wild Shores New Music as the state celebrates its sesquicentennial of William Henry Seward's purchase of the Russian America. Then on Thursday, April 13th at 7 p.m., we'll be presenting a panel discussion, 100 Years, World War I and the Weight of Sacrifice, where the discussion will be centered around the new National World War I Memorial that's to be built at Pershing Park in Washington, D.C. To find out more about these and our other programs, you can take one of our monthly event calendars, which you'll find in the theater lobby, or you can visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today is Presidential Libraries as Performance, Curating American Character from Herbert Hoover to George W. Bush by Jodi Kantor. Dr. Jodi Kantor is an Associate Professor of Theater in the Department of Theater and Dance, Columbian College of Arts and Sciences at George Washington University. She has served as dramaturg for a number of professional productions at Washington area theaters. Her larger focus is on strengthening communities through adaptation and performance. To this end, she has created workshops, events, and productions in a wide variety of settings, including theaters, hospices, prisons, cultural centers, libraries, galleries, schools, and other public spaces. Her previous book, Performing Loss, Rebuilding Community Through Theater and Writing, explores how communities can use performance to respond to shared experiences of grief. Kantor's scholarly articles have appeared in Text and Performance Quarterly, Theater Annual, Cultural Studies Critical Methodologies, and in several edited volumes. She currently serves on the editorial board of Text and Performance Quarterly. Kantor holds a BA in English Literature from Harvard University, an MA in Communication Studies from UNC Chapel Hill, and a PhD in Performance Studies from Northwestern University. She is a trained facilitator of Augusto Boals Theater of the Oppressed, and before joining the faculty at GW, Kantor was Associate Professor of Theater and Dance at Missouri State University, where she won awards for her teaching, creative work, and service. Please join me in welcoming Jodi Kantor to the National Archives.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. The setting is Washington, D.C. It is winter of 1938. The curtain opens on an office, but not just any office. This one is so famous that it has its very own name, recognized around the world as a place of power, the Oval Office. Seated at the desk inside the house he has called home for the last 5 years, President Franklin Roosevelt is worrying about history. In many ways, this is the very practice for which the office was designed, but he is not at this moment worried about shaping the content of history. Rather, he is concerned about influencing public access to it. Specifically, he is worried about whether millions of our citizens from every part of the land will have access to the historical documents of this time and place, to the story of what we have lived and are living today. He knows that he wants to be able to answer this question differently than it has been answered before. Along with some of his contemporaries, Roosevelt is perhaps the first high-ranking politician to worry about public access to presidential history in this way. Roosevelt is not a selfless man. Like any other head of state, ancient or modern, he seeks to secure for himself a vaunted place in the history of the nation, and with it, the world. But Roosevelt has also begun to develop a critical consciousness about the relationship between history and power. He has begun to understand the problems with the prevailing approach to history that Howard Zinn would influentially articulate 40 years later. And this is Zinn. The past is told from the point of view of governments, conquerors, diplomats, leaders. It is as if they, like Columbus, deserve universal acceptance, as if they, the founding fathers, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, the leading members of Congress, the famous justices of the Supreme Court, represent the nation as a whole. Traditional forms of public history, Roosevelt recognizes, promote patriotism, but they also underrepresent and even misrepresent those who lack the numbers, money, or other resources to make themselves heard. President Roosevelt and his advisors were the first national leaders to act on this emerging awareness of the narrowness of American public history. They took important steps to embed within the federal government an approach to public history that expanded the definition of the historic. Through efforts such as the Historic American Building Survey and the Works Progress Administration with its Federal Writers Program of citizen historians. And at the president's initiative, they commissioned the first presidential library to preserve the primary sources of American history. In making his presidential materials publicly available, Roosevelt explicitly affirmed the historic value of broad civic participation, proclaiming his faith in, he said, the capacity of America's own people so to learn from the past that they can gain in judgment in creating their own future. And at the library's dedication, a small ceremony to which he invited the facility's neighbors through an ad in the local newspaper, Roosevelt speculated aloud that future generations of Americans would be grateful for his foresight. So I wanted to share that passage directly from my book because it's really the beginning. And here's an image that you can find on the website of the FDR Library. Of the dedication of this first library, which was a community event in a very real sense. I wanted to tell you a little bit, for those who don't know, about the structure that Roosevelt set up by which presidential libraries would henceforth be governed. The structure could be characterized as a public-private partnership. The way it worked was that Roosevelt, and in the future, his presidential foundation and the presidential foundations of other presidents would raise the money to build the library and would oversee its first display. And upon the dedication ceremony, at that very moment, the administration of the libraries would be transferred to the National Archives. And that arrangement has had, I think, a democratizing influence on these institutions, the public institutions of the presidential libraries. And I think that democratizing impulse is probably nowhere more glaringly demonstrated than at the Nixon Library. As some of you may know, the Nixon Library originally opened as a private library, a private institution. Nixon opted out of the federal system. And there ensued what the former director of presidential libraries called the 30 Years' War, in which two factions represented by Nixon's two daughters, fought in the courts and elsewhere about whether or not this library was going to become part of the National Library System. So 30 years later, that fight was won by the faction that wanted it to be a part of the system, and the condition upon which that change was made was that there had to be a Watergate exhibit, a substantive Watergate exhibit in the new library. So the first director of the library under the federal system, there were directors before, but this director was appointed by the National Archives, set about doing just that. And in 2007, this exhibit, of which I'm just showing you here a very small piece, but it's a wall-length exhibit, and I wanted to show you this piece so you could see it in a little more detail. This exhibit, if it can be criticized, I would say it could only be criticized on the basis of sharing an overwhelmingly large amount of information. So it erred on the other side in really giving a very extensive history of the very complex events of the Watergate scandal. In addition to this full wall that you see here, there is also a series of monitors on which you can pull up oral history material and a film. So it's a very large exhibit. And this sort of democratizing influence of the National Archives has continued, and I say with great hope that it has become stronger, I think. For example, the Reagan Library took, I believe it was 20 years. Is that right? Somewhere between 10 and 20 years to redo its exhibit so that it gave a full accounting of the Iran-Contra scandal. So that was a significantly shorter amount of time than it took to create this Watergate exhibit. And then the Clinton Library opened with the impeachment story as part of the library. So they didn't even really think about not having it there. Now, one hopes for it to become more robustly represented over time, and I expect that that will happen, but it was there when the exhibit opened. So I'm going to talk to you about some displays within the museums that I think illustrate this inclusive and sort of democratic ideal of the presidential libraries. This is a favorite exhibit of mine from the Carter Library. This was not in the original Carter Library. So this exhibit resulted from a renovation that they did in 2009, which was 13 years after the library opened. And one of the large changes in the new exhibit was a very expanded exhibit on Carter's very early years. And as you can see from the heading on the side there, this exhibit really focused on the African Americans in his community who were extremely influential in his early years. And not only did it do that in passing, but it actually shared, as you can see, images of those people. It named those people and really emphasized Carter's the advantages he gained from this intimacy with people who were different from him. This is not a display, but this is the outside of the Clinton Library. The Clinton Library was consciously modeled after the slogan of his re-election campaign, which was a bridge to the 21st century. And as you can a little bit tell here, the building looks like a bridge, and most importantly, it looks like an unfinished bridge, with the end of it sort of arcing out over the Arkansas River. And the idea in Clinton's speeches and the idea that's embodied in the building and in a lot of the displays was that we all had a role in building and finishing the bridge. So the displays inside the library also emphasize this in a number of different ways. For example, the Clinton Library has the most extensive exhibit on the vice presidency of any of the libraries. It also highlights his relationship with Nelson Mandela. There are a number of different ways in which it emphasizes working together. Actually, before we talk about the visitor's experience, I want to talk about a couple of other displays in other libraries. The first one I want to mention that I don't have an image of is at the Hoover Library in West Branch, Iowa. The Hoover Library has what, for me, is perhaps the most moving, I guess you'd call it a display, of any of the libraries, and that is a video that has its own little space in the library with chairs around it, that shows excerpts from oral histories conducted with people who were children in the First World War and who were influenced in profound ways by Hoover's humanitarian work. And it's getting to hear these voices of ordinary people talking about the impact of his pre-presidential work on their lives is very moving. The details are still with me. It was many years ago now that I visited the Hoover Library, but there's a man who talks about the smell of the Hoover rolls when he first smelled them, and how revolutionary that smell was for him. Somebody else who talks about having being allotted his own plate by this humanitarian effort, and the amazing experience of having his very own plate. The other one I wanted to mention, which I think is perhaps surprising, is in the Eisenhower Library. The Eisenhower Library is the only presidential library so far that dedicates space to communities of people who were struggling during the Eisenhower years, during the presidential years. So, and that exhibit at the Eisenhower Library is called simply The Other America. So there's a large display on the 1950s and all of the new inventions and cultural joys of the 1950s. But then in the next room, there's this large panel titled The Other America, which begins with a sentence that is something like, not all Americans shared in the boom times. And it talks about 3 or 4 different specific communities that really struggled during his presidency. I want to talk next about 2 kind of live experiences in 2 different presidential libraries, which I think contribute to this sense of civic participation. The first one is in the first George Bush Library, and it's called the Gulf War Theater. And it is the only example so far in the presidential libraries of an immersive, what museum people call an immersive exhibit. And the visitor walks into this space, sits on one of these crates that you see in the foreground of the photograph, and listens to the voices of soldiers who fought in the war being played, very short snippets, sort of like a collage of these voices talking about their experiences. And what you can't see in the photograph is that the lights shift while you're sitting there listening, and the space in the center of the photograph that looks like it might be a hole is actually a screen. And that screen shows images from the war, but very close up and somewhat abstracted images. So you're not looking at TV footage of the Gulf War, you're really looking at sort of evocative imagery taken from the news footage. So this exhibit, I think, really encourages the visitor to stay put for a while, and to experience in a number of different sensory and physical ways what it might have been like to be a part of that conflict. The second one I want to talk about is not an immersive exhibit, but it's an unusual example of a library's way of dealing with the legacy of a president. So I should pause here and say that the presidential libraries are structured in similar ways, and that structure is more or less chronological, that you walk through an exhibit on their early years, and then their pre-presidential career, and then their presidential years, and then their post-presidency, and then their legacy. And I got very interested in how one represents a legacy. And this, I thought, was such an interesting and participatory, though not in the sense of the George Bush Library, but way of doing it. So this exhibit is called LBJ and You, and it talks about the ways in which LBJ's presidency continues to act upon our lives and our bodies today. So You can see Big Bird, right, in this photograph, and there's a question next to that photograph that says, have you ever watched public television? If you have watched public television, then you have been influenced by this legacy. 2 images down from Big Bird, there's a boy buckling himself in with a seatbelt. The text says, have you ever used a seatbelt? So it's a really intimate, in a way, and personal way of thinking about how leadership affects ordinary people. So I'll end with a few ideas about how I think the libraries can do better what they do. And then I'm happy to take whatever questions you might have. One thing that the libraries can do, and this is something I should say that museums in general struggle with, is to bring in a more diverse visitorship. When I spoke with Sam McClure, who was at the time the deputy director of presidential libraries at the National Archives, I asked him, why is it that you haven't really done any studies on who comes to the libraries demographically? And he said, it's because we don't need a survey to know how old and white we are. So that is an issue that the Archives is aware of, and again, many other museums are aware of. And I think there are a couple of ways to come at that, besides public programming, which is sort of beyond the scope of what I'm talking about today. But one is to create displays like the ones that I've already mentioned, where people see citizens who look like them, right? Who look like themselves. And the other is to make clever use and innovative use of oral history materials. I mentioned that there's this beautiful display at the Hoover Library. At the most recent library, the George W. Bush Library, there's a space dedicated to actually collecting oral histories. So if you are a visitor, actually they're not, I should say, they're not oral. They are typed for the most part, I think, into a computer. But if you visit there, you can include your story in the story of the Bush years, which I think is kind of exciting, and I'm interested to see what they'll do in terms of how they archive that material. Another thing that I think has not been paid great attention to is a section of the libraries that I didn't mention in my quick rundown, which I call the culture gallery. So in most, if not all, of the presidential libraries, there is a big space where the visitor can see film posters and listen to music and look at video clips of movies, all sort of in the interest of soaking up the time period. I find these culture galleries in general not so effective, and the reason is that they are kind of a sensory bombardment. You know, you have very small samples of influential artwork of one kind or another, and it's just a little overwhelming to the senses. What would be interesting, I think, would be to step back from that approach to the culture of the time period and really think about being more selective and choosing particularly influential pieces for the visitor to get a larger sample of. So maybe you'd get to see an entire scene from a film, or you'd get to hear, maybe with headphones, maybe not, you'd get to hear an entire song from the Billboard list. Anyway, I think that's one way through art to get at diversity. The other thing that some of the libraries are doing in terms of thinking about democracy and civic participation is thinking about the role that the institution of the Presidential Library itself plays in civic action. So, one thing I should note that has often been mentioned as a virtue of the presidential libraries is that they're not here in DC, right? They're all over the country, and some are in big cities, some are in small towns, but they have that sort of structural democratizing influence also, in that they are available to people who otherwise might not be able to see them. Some models of the kind of institutional thinking about civic action that I'm thinking of are probably most famously the Carter Center, which developed at the same time as the Carter Library and is on the same campus. And actually within the Presidential Library, there's a last exhibit that is dedicated to the work of the Carter Center, and you can learn all about what they do and how people become involved in their humanitarian work around the world. Another and much less well-known example of this is in the first George Bush Library. At the end of the exhibit, they have an electronic system set up by which you can choose an issue that concerns you at the community level, and you can type that issue into the computer, and the computer will print out organizations in your, I can't remember if it's zip code or how they chart the territory, but local organizations that are working on that issue. So you can leave with this printout of places you could call to get involved. And then finally, a library that is thinking a great deal about itself as an institution and what its role might be in strengthening communities through civic participation is the Obama Library, which of course doesn't exist yet, but consistent with his work, early work as a community organizer, I think the board and the people at the foundation are really, from the get-go, thinking about what can we actually do in this space that can make change in the world around us and support people in the world immediately around us. So with that, I will close. I'll just flag, I haven't talked much about the title of my book, and I'm happy to talk about that. And of course, there are lots and lots of other great examples of things the libraries are doing, but I will leave it there and turn to you for questions. Oh, and I've been told to tell you that there are microphones on either side for you to be heard asking questions. Hi. Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much for your words today. I'm a college student here in the Washington, D.C. area and have been greatly interested in presidential history for several years. One thing that I find to be particularly interesting is that the Roosevelt Library, the FDR Library, was dedicated when President Roosevelt was still in office,
Yes.
and I believe that that's the only presidential library which existed when its subject was still in office. My question is, do you think the fact that President Roosevelt was still in office, do you think that the fact that President Roosevelt was still in office influenced the Roosevelt Library in any major way?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know. Well, it influenced the library in one very concrete way, which is that Roosevelt used his office in that library. So it was designed with that intention. So there's that. In terms of what I'm guessing you're really asking about, which is the content of the displays and that kind of thing, I'm not actually sure that it did influence in a different way than any of the other presidents who were still around and alive when the library was being built. But it's an interesting thing to think about. I'd like to think about it
Yes.
some more.
You were first. Go ahead.
Thanks. I actually do presidential libraries, which is why I'm here today. And so I was actually going to ask the question that you left us with is, where does the title of the lecture and performance, if you could tie the performance in the title and also in your PhD degree, so I can make this.
And also what?
In your PhD degree.
Oh, yeah, sure. So my background is in a discipline called performance studies, which is different from theater studies. Performance studies is a discipline that looks at and defines performance extremely broadly. So the discipline is interested in how, for example, so linking it to the book, I'm interested in how the libraries invite us to behave when we're there. I'm interested in the role they create for the president and the role they create for the citizen. And as I said toward the end, I'm interested in how the institutions themselves act in the world. Does that clarify? Yeah, okay, thanks.
My question was, how did you get interested in doing this, basically? So
I need a better story for this, but I'll tell you that I had the opportunity to, thanks to the person I was dating at the time, who's now my husband, who's here, I had the opportunity to go to the Clinton Library pretty soon after it opened. So it was a thing that people were doing, is going to the Clinton Library. And I found it fascinating. And the first question I had when I came out of it was, gee, I wonder what the Reagan Library is like, because he's the other two-term president that we've had in my memory. And so I had the idea of going to the Reagan Library and initially just writing a little article or something that was looking at them. And I went to the Reagan Library, and indeed, it is dramatically different in a zillion ways from the Clinton Library. And actually, there is a chapter in my book that compares those two libraries. But I think once I got started, I just became fascinated by more than just the displays. I became interested in the history and in the division of labor between the foundation and the National Archives. And, one other thing is that there existed at the time only one study of presidential libraries, came out in 2006. That study is written by a historian, and the title of it is Presidential Temples. And you can glean from that title that this was a historian who was very dissatisfied with the presidential libraries as history. And it seemed to me that he had interesting things to say, and particularly interesting things to say about the Truman Library, but it seemed to me that the presidential libraries were up to more than just telling history, which connects to the question about performance. So I thought that my background and training gave me a perspective on what they were doing in the landscape besides just narrating history. That was a long answer.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. I'm not from the United States, I'm from the Caribbean. So what I'm interested in is another part of the library, although you touched on it in the George W. Bush Library, the Gulf War, is, two questions. The first question is the change that was brought about in the Nixon Library concerning Watergate, the inclusion of Watergate. Did that come about because of activities outside, that people who had been inside were in open protest against what was being shown there and felt that it was really not showing, at best as you can, some balanced version of what was going on inside during that time? This is the first question. The second question is concerning the relationship, obviously, United States presidents, and starting out in the 20th century, became not only presidents of the United States, basically, they became like presidents of the entire world. The United States became the hegemonic and the dominant power. So how do you think these libraries show this U.S. role in the world? For example, we can take, you talked a little bit about the Johnson Library. How did it show the whole controversy surrounding Vietnam, or the Kennedy Library with that, Nixon? And is any opportunity afforded in these libraries not only to U.S. citizens, but to people from the outside, right? The countries on which the United States had impact, to talk a little bit about their experiences concerning that presidency, or is it very much America-centric and told from an American standpoint? Thank you very much.
And remind me of the first.
The first question would be, the change that, if you remember, you're talking about the Nixon Library, that it took 30 years to include.
Yes.
Was this a consequence of, and that could be talk about performance, because I saw that in your work, you talk about Auguste Boal's Theater of the Oppressed, right? Mm-hmm. The notion of the library being a kind of a way to further deepen democracy and radicalize and change society, right? That can be problematical, but the issue is that problematical in the sense that obviously the library, if it's my library, I wanted to show me in a good light, obviously, right? So that's the balance that you have. But how do you think those things play out? And which library that you have gone to would you think comes closest to to Boal's notion of a theater of the press? Do you think maybe this Obama presidency, the Clinton library, or which one do you think? So those are 3 questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I would love to say that the change in the Nixon Library came about through grassroots revolution, but in fact, that's really not what happened. Really, what was at stake in that protracted conversation / argument was really Nixon's place in history, and the strong sense that some of his supporters had that if he was excluded from this set of institutions that was now a fairly robust set of institutions that were tied together, that his legacy might be diminished by that exclusion. So that even if it meant having to tell a more complex and somewhat less flattering story, that it was worth doing that in order to be included in the civic institution of the Presidential Library. And that conversation really wasn't among visitors. It was really, and in fact, people who visited the library when it was a private library tended to be Nixon supporters and therefore tended to be perfectly happy with the private exhibit as it was. But it was really colleagues and supporters of the president who had a different view of how to preserve his legacy best. In terms of theater of the oppressed, that's such a great question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that Eisenhower display, which is really, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's not really very radical. But in the context of these presidential libraries, the idea of really delving into, and it could be, you know, that exhibit could be bigger and it could be deeper, but the idea of really giving space and airtime to communities who were not doing so well under the Eisenhower presidency, I think is an important contribution. And yeah, I think my hope is that the Obama Library will go even further in that direction. And I guess the Carter Center too. Certainly, if you're talking about the interaction between the U.S. and other countries internationally, the Carter Center does that more than any other institution in the system.
I have a comment and a question, and the comment piggybacks on your statement that you're interested in how what the landscape of presidential libraries says about the library and the president, perhaps. I went to the Nixon Library, and at the end of the exhibit, you walk out and you see the tombs of Mr. and Mrs. Nixon. And then there's this little white house that you can tour that is his childhood home. And so I assumed that they had moved the home to the library site, but I was told that no, he chose the site of his childhood home for his library, which I thought was just interesting, an interesting statement about him that I was surprised. But then my question is, I understand that the libraries are a partnership between private and public. Does the private foundation stop its involvement when the government takes over, or do they continue to work together?
That's a great question. The answer is the latter, that they continue to work together. The National Archives has a lot of the administrative responsibilities. The Presidential Foundation does things like they run the gift shop, and they pay for certain exhibits that are above and beyond what the scope of the Presidential Library. For example, the most obvious example is at the Reagan Library, there's this Air Force One exhibit where you walk into this glass enclosed room and Air Force One is sitting there before you and you can go in it. And that exhibit was paid for by the foundation. One of the things I say in the book is that I think the libraries could be clearer about that, about who is supporting what pieces of the story. But yeah. And the foundations, there's a institutional relationship that's ongoing between the foundation and the library.
So I wanted to talk, or make some comment or just respond to your question about having more and more people visit the museums and at the libraries, and also people who represent much more of the fabric of American life. So I just stumbled into them, and probably because I was older, I had more time, and probably because I passed through Abilene, Kansas. But there are lots of people whose travels don't take them through Abilene, Kansas, for example. And so I'm struck. I'm a recent resident. Recently came to Washington D.C. and I've been visiting the libraries. Yesterday I was at the library, or the American History Museum, and we spent a lot of time in the presidential area there. And each of the presidents was listed, and there were some children next to me, and they made some comments. And it occurred to me that we have that wonderful display there that can't possibly give the kind of context that each of these lives is, because together they tell the story of America, each one of them representing about almost a decade in many cases. Then I was at the Portrait Museum, and the same thing, wonderful portraits, and it's sort of taken me a lifetime, I'm sure, to collect all the stories. But I'm wondering if perhaps we could get more visibility about the libraries and their existence by just making some connections among our own existing organizations, so that if within the Smithsonian, just referring the existence of these things. It may sound pretty simplistic, because I understand they're just like your previous answer. These are complicated organizations, and all of these are complicated organizations. But I think there's just a question of not knowing they exist. And so I was wondering if you think it's the complexity of organizations that keeps people from even knowing about them.
I don't think so. And the National Archives has made some efforts in that direction. One really simple but very concrete one is that now when you walk into any one of the libraries, you get a little pamphlet that says, here are all the presidential libraries, and you should go see them. And that seems super obvious, but it wasn't the case 10 years ago. Also, on the web, they're making more connections. There's a visible presence of the National Archives and an ease of getting from one library to another on the web that didn't used to be there. So I know they're aware of that. I think the idea of linking to other kinds of institutions is an interesting one. Also, something in what you said made me want to mention that there's a chapter in the book about failure and about the representation of presidential failure in the museums. And one of the things I'm arguing is that it's actually a great service to visitors to include those stories. And I guess I would just plug, if you haven't been to the Ford Library, there's some really interesting documentation there of what, and actually in general, any of the libraries that deal with one-term presidents sort of by definition have to deal with the failure to be reelected, although it didn't always used to be thought of that way. Yeah, so I found myself really interested in the one-term presidential libraries, even though I started out looking at these two-term libraries. And I think part of the reason is there's, chronologically speaking, there's a shorter story to tell. So I think the potential for depth is greater in some ways at those libraries. Okay. Thank you so much.